Welcome back to the Real Mr. Mom. I'm Seeds, and today's episode, this is gonna be just something that I have an interest in, and who knows, maybe I'll talk to somebody who also has an interest in it. So over the years, my wife has she's always been into, let's say, murder mysteries and such, and 2020 and homicide hunters and true crime and all this stuff where people actually get killed, and it's talking about serial killers and anywho, but yeah, so for a long time I avoided those things. A big part of it had to just do with my own mental health and just not wanting to get information, and specifically detailed information on the horrific reality of the people around us in this world. It was one of those things where I'm much more like movies like Judge Dredd or other say just movies where the bad guys just get annihilated. It's like, yes, there are evil people in the movies I watch, but they always get their comeuppance, by the end of the 2 hours or whatever the movie is. And so anyhow, so I actually got into watching some of these shows with my wife, and really one of the things that I found fascinating was just just learning from them. That's one of the things that I think I've appreciated. Growing up, that made school pretty easy for me. Generally, just going through grade school and high school, and I guess high school, grade school, yeah. Anyway, but was just my desire for knowledge, and again too, it's just one of those things where if I don't have an interest in something, then yes, I am not going to gain anything from it. It's going to be trying to shove a square object into a circle. It's just not going to fit. But anywho, that's one of the things I found out about watching those shows, was that just watching the mental health and watching the psychosis of the victims' families, and the evildoers. I don't even want to call them predators or what have you. The bad people that would kill people, and yeah, just trying to put together the pieces of like why people do things, and how people respond to trauma, and then also to just trying to find truths, and then again trying to find truths for the victims, and if there's any silver lining to their death, and and just stuff like that. And so yeah, I would say this first episode, I'm trying to create a little controversy, just to spark some interest, and again to spark conversations. And again too, this is just my observation. I really, other than watching this documentary, I have no real information into this, so take it as you do. But it's about Scott Peterson, because I personally don't think Scott Peterson killed his wife, Lacey Peterson. And again, this is something where, if everyone disagrees with me, that's fine. I'm not his lawyer. I'm not a big fan. Other than the story of him killing his wife, I didn't know who he was, so I really don't have any bias, and I really don't care if I don't convince anybody. But again, it's just something I found interesting. Watching the psychosis, and watching how people convicted him and judged him, and it was so much of it was based on emotion. So much of it was based on their own psychosis, their own mental health. And again, I'm not saying that it's not valid. I'm not saying that, again, anything I say is factual. It's just what I observed. And so I'm going to just dive right into it. So when I was watching this documentary with my wife, I literally because again, usually she'll be watching these things and I'll look at it and I'll just kind of, I used to just walk out of the room. I just was like, I don't want to know the horrible things that this jackass did. But anywho, so yes, at this point in my life, I started watching it because I found it mentally interesting. I found it psychologically interesting. And so I watched this documentary, and the interesting thing was when I saw, the context of it, I remember internally thinking, isn't that the guy who killed his wife? And so that was kind of one of the compelling things that convinced me that I was right when I think he's innocent, was because I went into this documentary thinking he's guilty. And this wasn't a Scott Peterson's innocent documentary. It was just a Scott Peterson, Lacey Peterson story. And there was a couple people that were defending Scott Peterson in this documentary. And there's several that were accusing and judging. And on, I would say probably at least half, if not more than half, like 75% of all the people in this documentary were talking about his guilt. So again, this wasn't some sort of biased message to me. It was me just taking in the information, taking in how the media portrayed it, why they thought the way they thought, what they didn't like about it, why they thought he was guilty, and then making my own assessment. And so that was really the interesting thing, was going into it. Like I said, I thought he was guilty. And so that really was kind of a compelling thing for me to think, I don't think he did it. And again, I'm not saying, when I'm making this argument, I'm not saying this because, again, I'm trying to get him away with something. I'm not, I thought, it would be fun in another life to be a lawyer, to be able to make these arguments. But again, I'm simply just making this statement because it's something I observed. I thought interesting. I explained it to my wife. She didn't fully agree with me, but she did see what I was talking about, and she did kind of take a step back and say, like, maybe you're right. And again, I'm not just pleading for everyone's innocence, because there's plenty of those videos I saw where I'm like, the SOB's guilty, fry him. So again, this isn't just something where I just make the argument that people are innocent and I can just manipulate information and say this. But anyhow, I'm distracting from the point of the conversation. So at the very beginning of this documentary, in the story, Lacey Peterson goes missing. Her dog is found on a leash outside of their house, and no one knows what happened to her. So there are some whispers, some, and I can't remember if Scott himself said something about how she was supposed to go on a walk that day. And I think it was like Christmas Eve, which is another thing why people were just kind of like, what's going on? Why on Christmas Eve was she by herself? And again, these are intriguing, relevant questions. People's behavior and the date in which their behavior is happening is relevant. But again, so I'm just going to kind of fast forward a little bit to where, this is when, things really started picking up and people were worrying. They hadn't heard from her, and I can't remember how much time had passed before, the news and the community started getting involved. But I just remember that I think it was Nancy Grace was talking about his behavior, Scott Peterson's behavior at the press conference. And she was saying, if this was my wife, if I was in his situation, I would have been bawling and pleading with the news cameras, please, if anybody knows her location, if you took her, please return her. And she was comparing herself and how she would have behaved in his situation if they were reversed. And it's just one of those things where, I know that Nancy Grace, I think it's her name, I know that I think her husband was killed by a disgruntled employee at work. And so, I know she's been through her own trauma. But it saddens me to think that somehow that somebody has the arrogance to think that because they've been through some trauma that they can somehow predict what another person will do. And I would say that I think that she probably needs to self-reflect on that effect of trauma, because the fact that she actually, and again, too, I know you can assess it. I think that when you experience trauma, you have an understanding, but you don't know. And so that's one of the things I would discourage people from doing, is you're looking at his behavior and saying, well, if I would do that, I know this is how I would respond. And you don't have any idea. And just, even if that was true, even if it was true that somehow you can know how you would respond in a situation that you've never been in, how would you know that everyone would respond that way? Because I can testify that not everyone who lost a loved one in war responds the same way. I can testify to that. I can testify to the fact that not everyone who loses a twin responds the same way. And both those things happen to me. So again, it just because they're not responding how you would respond does not mean anything. And it's interesting because as the story develops, the quote nail in the coffin for the media and for society and everyone who judged him, actually to me explains his behavior. But we'll get back to that in a second. So again, I want to try to say that the next thing was the fact that her body ends up showing up. And I may have to go back and forth through some of this because, again, I watched the documentary once and it's just something that popped in my head. Anyhow, so her body was found in the San Francisco Bay. And, again, that was where he goes fishing or what have you. And, again, her DNA, aka a hair, was found on a pair of pliers on his boat that he, uses on the San Francisco Bay. So people are, the body was found where he usually goes fishing, and her DNA was on the boat that hypothetically he would have used to dump the body. Again, that is hypothetically possible, but there's nothing especially incriminating or shocking about this DNA. It's his wife. I would assume that some of her hair was on the boat. I would assume some of her hair was on his coat that could have gotten on the boat. And I would assume that if anybody killed her, they would dump her in the San Francisco Bay. It's not Scott Peterson Bay. It's not like it's only access to him on his property or family property or a place that he only knows about. It's the San Francisco freaking Bay. There's gobs of people that have access to that. So again, That's like saying that her body was found in the same state that they lived. That's not incriminating to him. Again, you're emotionally condemning this man. And again, I think that was probably the biggest mistake that the media and those who blamed him made, was emotionally judging him before they had all the facts. Emotionally crucifying him before they knew who was guilty, because that's one thing I have learned personally and observing other people, is that if you emotionally convict somebody, it's almost impossible to undo it. And I'm going to talk about more, not necessarily murder stories, but more, I would say, front page stories about that emotional conviction and how powerful that is to explain people's behavior. But anyhow, so back to Scott Peterson, Lacey Peterson. That was one of the other things that was interesting, was, again, to point out his innocence. If he wasn't, in fact, guilty at the time of when she would have already been murdered, before he went to his boat, before he went on San Francisco Bay, as they report, his guilt was incriminating because she was found there. He spent an hour and a half at his work office looking up how to assemble a piece of furniture. Now, again, hypothesizing, have no personal experience in it, never going to. But if I were to take someone's life, I would certainly not spend an hour and a half with their body in my truck before I got rid of the body. I would do it as fast as freaking possible. So again, not the behavior of somebody who is on the run, not the behavior of somebody who's hiding a murder. So again, and that doesn't prove his innocence, but also doesn't prove his guilt. That's more or less what I'm trying to say. Is it's just really kind of odd. Like, if he did this, why in the world would he do that? Why would he look up how to assemble furniture? It'd be incriminating if he looked up, how to get rid of a body in San Francisco Bay. That would be like, holy heck, done. But he didn't. He was looking up how to assemble furniture. And again, so this is the nail in the coffin in the public's eyes, or at least it's the last two. And this is what leads to the beginning of why I was going to explain his behavior, his odd behavior in front of the cameras, or not in front of the cameras, not going in front of the cameras. So I can't remember how long after, she was missing and the media was painting him as potentially guilty or whatever. But there came out that he had a girlfriend, and that. I remember when Nancy Grace was talking about how that was what I was expecting. When that found out, I knew he was guilty, and I'm just like, somebody having an affair does not mean that they murdered their spouse. Look at how many people have affairs every year. They don't murder their spouses. The majority of people who have affairs don't murder their spouses. So I don't know why you would think just because you have an affair that he'd murder his spouse. Now, it has led to it. There have been stories where people have killed their spouses because they had affairs and they didn't want to deal with the divorce or whatever. So that is a potential theory. That's a potential, motive. But it certainly does not mean he did or didn't. But the one thing it does do is does explain his behavior at the beginning of all of this. When he wasn't standing in front of the camera sobbing about, please send my wife back, please help my wife. The reason he wasn't sobbing, or again, I'm hypothesizing, I'm just analyzing his behavior and his psychosis, was I'm almost certain that he probably was thinking, I am the biggest scumbag in the world. He knew his affair was going to eventually come out. And so he's not going to go to the cameras and act like the supporting, sorrow freaking husband, because he feels like a complete dirtbag, because he knows that when this comes out, everyone's going to hate me. He knows that his in-laws are going to hate him. He knows that his own family, I'm sure, is going to have a lot of distaste for him for what he was doing. For having an affair on his pregnant wife, and then she ends up going missing and gets murdered. Like, you're not going to feel bad for hating somebody who did that to somebody. And he knew that was coming. And so I'm sure that's probably why he didn't get in front of the cameras and put on some fake facade. I'm sure he felt like he didn't deserve to have the world feel bad for him. He didn't deserve to have the cameras on him sobbing. And so I think that explains his odd behavior, his lack of emotion in front of the camera. In fact, I think there was one point where he was, with the group of people searching, and he was talking to one of them. He started laughing, and again, Nancy Grace is just like, "What's this? Why is he laughing?" And I'm like, he sure is probably trying to tell himself jokes, from, he'd be bawling, but he'd be bawling because he's such a sad sack of dirt. I'm trying to prevent myself from using rough language, but anyway. And so the final nail in the coffin of his guilt, and again, I can explain this from his psychosis, and again, I don't have to believe me, was the fact that he buys a plane ticket to the Bahamas or somewhere. He buys a plane ticket to Mexico, or he's leaving the country. He's fleeing the country. So he's caught fleeing the country He's not actually fleeing the country, but I believe he's en route to. And his hair's dyed, and so again, he's disguising himself, and he's fleeing the country, and everyone's like, "Ha ha! We knew you were guilty when you came out, you were having an affair, and now we know you're guilty because now you're fleeing, and innocent people don't flee." And it's just like, I see the general, yes, if you've got nothing to hide, why are you hiding? That type of assessment. But the one thing that you have to take into account is this guy was essentially crucified and said to be guilty the second the cameras were on him. This guy was number one suspect. And then as things unfolded, again, this is something that, going back to it, just take the facts. He's having an affair. His wife goes missing. She's probably killed. Her body shows up. Yes, she is killed. Everyone thinks you're guilty. This guy didn't have an escape route. He had no way of surviving this. So even if they had proven his innocence with the murder, he still would have been viewed as a total scumbag who had an affair on his pregnant wife who got murdered, and his child got murdered. Like, so that front line never would have left. And so you go to the point where his girlfriend comes out and finds out what happened. She turns on him and says, "Oh my gosh, my boyfriend who's a scumbag who's cheating on his pregnant wife is a murderer." And everyone turns on him. His in-laws turn on him. At that point, when he was fleeing the country and changed his hair color, what did he have to lose? He didn't have a girlfriend, didn't have a wife, didn't have in-laws. I'm sure his family didn't like him. I'm sure his friends hated him. The media had crucified him the entire time. What was he giving up to flee? What guilt was he showing other than the guilt that they already assumed he had? So, again, I'm not saying he handled it right. I'm not saying he's a good person. But I am saying I think people emotionally convicted him from the get-go, and as it proceeded, as they found out he was having an affair, and then again he was fleeing the country because he didn't think that anybody believed him. He figured I have nothing to lose. Yeah, so I think that is, and again, when I'm making these statements, I'm making it more because I think it's important to judge somebody for what they did. I think that if someone's a scumbag in one way or another, we should refer to them as a scumbag in the nature that they are, and not just be like, oh, let's chalk up some more things, because it's like, well, he's a jerk, so why should we care if we falsely accuse him? It's like, no, because there's an importance of being accurate. There's an importance of having convictions and holding somebody accountable for what they did, not say, well, because he's a scumbag over here, it's okay if we elaborate a little more because he's a scumbag. Like, it's okay to be a jerk to a scumbag, and it's like, well, maybe that's why he's a scumbag. I mean, I'm not saying I know that, but again, it's just. In the next one, I'll be talking about the innocence, and I think will be a less controversial thing. But again, too, I want to explain the psychosis. Like I said, when I'm explaining to people that think that Scott Peterson's guilty, I'm not saying that they're idiots. I'm not saying that they're bad people. I'm not saying that it's wrong and horrible. I'm saying that I think that people who do think he's guilty are wrong, and I think this is why. I understand that. I understand that once you emotionally commit somebody to being a horrible, evil human being, and you find something else out that debunks that, or at the very least discourages it, that you're more likely to continue to try to justify why you don't like that person, rather than just be like, oh, I was wrong, and again, because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're just trying to convict bad people. You're trying to stop evil. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't hold anything against anybody who thinks Scott Peterson is guilty, because if he was guilty, if he is guilty, it's a very easy person to not like. It's a very easy person to convict. So again, I'm not trying to act like a word-twisting lawyer. I'm just saying, if you look at the facts, if you look at what we actually know, and again, too, like I said, all that behavior that people thought was weird, all that again, the dog, and that was the thing that was so, at the end of the documentary I watched, there were multiple sources. Some were couples, some were individuals, but multiple sources, many of which didn't know who she was. They just described her. They looked at pictures of her and they said, we saw her walking her dog and having a confrontation with somebody just down the street from her house. And then that house actually got broken into. And I couldn't believe it, because there was actually like a police detective saying, well, that didn't happen because if it because there's no witnesses. And literally, like, right after that clip, it showed like 4 or 5 different witnesses that said, yeah, we saw her walking her dog and having this confrontation. And again, these are people that didn't know her. So it wasn't like it was like Scott Peterson's best friends, and they're like, oh yeah, we saw her. Yeah, she was over there somewhere. Like, why was the dog on the leash outside of the house? Like, why the heck would I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. it's just one of those things where, it's just, again, don't know 100%, but certainly, I mean, that's one of the things that's most shocking, just to finish with this subject, is the fact that Scott Peterson is actually on death row for the murder of Lacey Peterson, even though the only evidence is circumstantial. There's no physical evidence that proves anything. There's no DNA in the bed of his truck. There's no blood or anything. There's nothing. People emotionally convicted him. And again, I'm if you don't believe me, fine, whatever. It's not a big deal. I don't really care. I just think it is important to take a step back and again, get it right. Again, I think the next subject I'm going to be talking about with this specific subject, because I want to try to break up different segments to kind of just make more of a variety. And again, so hopefully that when people read the more controversial things like this, or the episode I talked about, it's going to be coming out with, I don't know, I'm doing some controversial things, and the idea is that I'm trying to, how I put it is make a vegetable cake with some good cheese cream frosting. So that you start digging in the cream cheese frosting because you're like, I like this. Next thing you know, you're eating some vegetables, because I think that a lot of people are avoidance of mental health conversations. I think they see it and they're like, that's something we need to do. Click, and they go to the what is it, Dude Perfect. They go to something that entertains them, makes them laugh or something. And so with this, I want to talk about controversial things. And again, the mental health aspect of it, the psychological aspect of it. But I also want this to kind of maybe be a venue to reach out to more people, so that they'll look at the more specific, personal healing, the real ugly nature of mental health. But the next one I'm going to be talking about with murder cases or whatever, or cases in the spotlight, I believe the one I want to do is the Central Park 5. And just kind of explain what was going on there and people's responses to it, because I know that the girl who was assaulted and raped did not, I can't even say that word, I need to look up the words I can't say, she got hard, was like really upset that the Central Park 5 got a settlement, and she thinks they're guilty. And so I want to explain why she's in that frame of mind, and again to the nature of why they were charged being guilty, and just from what I've seen. So just I just find it interesting. But as always, good luck and good night.